you're here. Now, as a reminder, we are hosting a Q&A session with Holly at 10 a.m. in room 6 for those that are interested in participating in that. Holly Ransom is a globally renowned content curator, speaker and master interviewer. Named one of Australia's most influential women by the Australian Financial Review, she's delivered a peace charter to the Dalai Lama and was Sir Richard Branson's nominee for Wired magazine's smart list of future game changers. She's had the honour of interviewing the likes of Barack Obama, Billie Jean King, Condoleezza Rice, and the world's first humanoid robot, Sophia. She's also a Fulbright scholar and a recipient of the prestigious Anne Wexler Public Policy Scholarship. And she, in 2021, released her book, The Leading Edge. Please welcome Holly Ransom.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. Good morning, everyone. How are we? Oof. Was 80s night last night that big? I'm going to give you one more chance for that. How are we? Good. All right, 80s night was that strong last night. That's okay. That's great. In fact, is anyone sitting next to someone who's still in what they were wearing last night? Maybe, for a few of you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with you. I know it's been a big couple of days and I'm very excited to open today and talk about something that hopefully will draw together, perhaps in a very different way, some of the ideas and macro trends you've been talking about into a really practical idea. We're going to talk a lot about courage this morning, which might seem like a bit of a strange topic, given I know you've been in a lot of technical conversations and strategic conversations. You've been talking about the future. But I want to make the argument to you this morning that the single most important habit that anyone can be cultivating right here, right now, any leader, and I use that inclusive of every single one of you in the room, the most important habit you can be building is to get comfortable being uncomfortable. Nobody can stand up here with conviction and tell you that they know exactly what tomorrow looks like. One of the things we can be pretty certain about is that the pace of change is not going to slow down anytime soon. In fact, it's kind of an extraordinary thought to contend with for just a moment that actually the pace of change we're dealing with right now, that things like Moore's Law would tell us, it's actually the slowest pace of change we're going to contend with moving forward. This is the new normal. This is the environment and the conditions that we need to get match fit for, dealing with complexity and ambiguity and uncertainty. And what I want to do today is give you some tools for how you can think about doing that for yourself, and also how you can think about bringing that into your workplace and helping to create the conditions for other people to thrive in the face of uncertainty. Because as much as it's going to be an individual competitive advantage, it's also going to be a competitive advantage of organisations to have that capacity to contend with uncertainty and the unknown. So one of the reasons this is so important is we all know we're contending with a lot of this, right? And in fact, Gartner's own research a couple of months ago came out and said it's not just one roller coaster the average person's going through, it's about 10 of these simultaneously. And we all know that there are some people who are straight out the other side, kind of at the end of the transformation journey. The way I like to create an analogy with that, the people we know in our lives, is do anyone resonate or have someone in their life who's the person that camps outside the Apple store the moment they release a new bit of technology because they just need to be the first person in the country to get their hands on it? So they're our early adopters, straight out the other side, on board with your transformation. And way down the other end of the spectrum, don't have to identify whether you are this person or know this person, but we generally have someone in our lives who's still doing CPR to their Nokia flip phone because God forbid that thing should die and they have to progress with their technological revolution, right? And ironic, I know, talking to CTOs and CIOs about the technology adoption curve, but we know there's a cultural element to it, right? I had the privilege of interviewing Malcolm Gladwell not too long ago, and one of the things he talked about is this disconnect often between when the technology or the opportunity, the potential exists, and the timing of the ability to accept it. You know, one of the stories he tells, and for those who've read his work, is about the telephone and how the telephone, the capability to communicate like that between human beings, existed long before it found a use case, and certainly long before it gained any kind of broad acceptance and uptake and use. And so there's this piece for thinking through, how do we support people to go on this journey of change and transformation with us? And how do we acknowledge that this is the backdrop that we're dealing with all the time, and adapt our strategies accordingly for that world? So what I want to talk a little bit about today, forgive me, I don't know why that box is appearing on the screen in the top right. It's got another graphic from something else. But I want to talk about some strategies from my book. People often ask me, with the work that I do, I get the great privilege of interviewing some of the most extraordinary leaders across the world. I've just finished a 3-city tour with James Clear over the last couple of days, the guy who wrote Atomic Habits and has built a habit-changing culture around the world. I've interviewed presidents, world champions, you name it. And people often ask the question, is there any commonality amongst all these high achievers who've been able to not just achieve success once, but have been able to sustain that level of performance in their chosen field for a period of time? And one of the things I would say is the striking thing is the work they have done and continue to do on themselves. So the first half and the first set of principles is this idea, until we can lead ourselves, we actually can't lead others. And that's not a destination. That is a continual gymnasium that we need to go to work in and build and adapt as that change continues to shape and shift the world around us. But we all know if it doesn't move beyond us, it doesn't actually become leadership. It doesn't mobilise towards a collective goal and set of outcomes. And so what I want to do today is talk about being uncomfortable and how we bridge it across that world of leading self into how we lead others through that change side of the equation. So we're going to touch on both parts of the coin. I want to start first with mindset, which is this first section. The book, if you're working your way down, is mindset, method, and mastery. I want to begin in mindset because so much of this comes down to how we're actually framing the story we're telling ourselves about the uncertainty. So much of where fear starts is actually in the story between here. One of the people I interviewed a couple of months ago now is Chris Voss. Some of you might know him. He's the FBI's chief hostage negotiator, or was for a very long time. It's quite an extraordinary role. Felt very funny as someone with the last name Ransom to be interviewing someone who's a hostage negotiator. But that aside, Chris has had this incredible career negotiating 230 plus international kidnappings. And you might imagine, high stakes, very high emotion conversations, a lot on the line. And one of the first things he'll talk to you about is neuroscience. And he'll say the most important thing to understand is in the absence of a positive narrative, we tell ourselves a negative one at a 2-to-1 ratio. He said, so much of my job in that type of situation is being able to present an alternative path, being able to help people see an out where they don't think they have one, being able to recreate the narrative that's so fixed and locked in someone's head that we're in this set of circumstances that we're in, this acute situation. And so it's useful to be mindful that often when we're even just using the word change, let alone whether or not we're then getting more specific about a particular one in our organisation's context or something like that, oftentimes that in of itself is engendering a level of fear, uncertainty, or negativity. And I like this quote, Eckhart Tolle, that says, if uncertainty is unacceptable to you, it leads to fear. It becomes something we worry about. Versus if there's an ability to build this acceptance and tolerance for it, it becomes an opportunity. It becomes a new landscape where there's the opportunity to do and achieve even more than we might have done the day before. So there's plenty of neuroscience that sits behind this, the capacity to change, the choice point where we get to exploit, there's opportunity there. But the question I really want to start us asking this morning before we do anything is, what's the story you're telling yourself? And what's the story you're telling other people when it comes to change? A moment of reflection to think about the language that we're using, whether it's about the state of the economy, whether it's the way that we've set up a new financial year and talked about targets and expectations and tried to fire up the team to get ready and rearing to go for what lies ahead. It's a useful thing to keep an eye on the conversations that we're having. What I'm talking about here really gets down to the heart of the language that we're using. And if you're looking for a reference point, I encourage you to check out the work of Carol Dweck, who was really the person who coined this term growth mindset. Stanford professor, great TED talk that's worth 20 minutes of your time, and has really birthed a whole new way of educating and increasingly a conversation around how we do feedback and how we seek to build organisational culture and do teaming more effectively. And her observation broadly was we kind of have two mindsets, and it's not like we either are one or the other. We're absolutely capable of having both, but people tend to default under stress to one or the other more. So some of us can find ourselves being more fixed mindset people, where there's a tendency to lock down. There's a tendency to avoid taking steps where we might find ourselves dealing with uncertainty. There's a worry that if a mistake is made, that it's a failure on me as opposed to a failure of the actual project or the thing that we were trying to implement. Growth mindset people, by contrast, see all of this as an opportunity. There's this notion that I can be better tomorrow than I am today. There's this idea that if I've got grit and determination, I can find my way through, over, round what it is that I need to get done and achieve. Now, that's a little bit more into the specifics of it. What I want to do is take us up slightly to a more macro view of these. And I want to just frame and allow us to pause and think for a moment about why this is so significant against the backdrop of change we mentioned moments ago. And it really boils down to me to these last three categories. If you think about a backdrop where you're dealing with the average 10 transformations and change in any one period of time, the final three categories there are constantly present. You are constantly going to be contending with challenges. You are absolutely going to have to take feedback on. Because as we know, change and transformation is not an overnight journey. It is often a multi-month, sometimes even multi-year process. The quote is often said, no strategy ever survives first contact with the customer. Well, it's a little bit that way often with the change and the transformation piece. No original plan for how that's going to get done survives first contact with your stakeholders. So the need to build this muscle of feedback is going to be absolutely critical. And of course, there's going to be an element of making mistakes. You're going to make some assumptions, they're not going to be right. You're going to try some things, they're not going to work. So how are we going to build this muscle and competency? And you look at the way that we see the road fork around the two mindsets and how they respond differently to these three prompts. So in a challenges context, a fixed mindset person is more inclined to give up, whereas someone who has a growth mindset says, I'm going to dig in here, I'm going to grit it out and find a way through. Someone who is a bit fixed mindset when it comes to feedback is going to try and stay away from it. They don't want it, they're going to get defensive, put up a wall. Someone who has got the opportunity to see themselves as better tomorrow than they are today is going to be hungry for it and seeking to bring it in. And finally, someone who's fixed mindset is probably going to try and avoid making mistakes. They're going to play it safe. They're going to cautiously take their toe, maybe dip it in, maybe not. They're not going to make bets. They're not going to have a culture of experimentation. And so we can see just at a basic level that they're creating those two very different mindsets lead to a very different set of habits and behaviours. And ultimately there, if we are, by definition, the product of what we repeatedly do, they lead to very different outcomes. And so to begin with, I want to argue that one of the more critical things we can do to begin with is catch the unconscious conversation we're having with ourselves about change and transformation and make an intentional effort to adopt more fixed mindset language. And I particularly encourage you to think about your organisation, your leadership, your team in the context of those three, what I would call stress points. Because it's fairly easy to sit there intellectually and go, oh yeah, growth mindset, that makes sense. It's good to talk about being better tomorrow than it is today. Yep, feedback, that makes sense, that sounds important. It's a very different thing when you're actually in the cut and thrust and you're feeling the heat of pressure and results and all of that to stick to it. And these key areas will be the make and break of whether or not we can maintain a growth mindset culture in our organisation and actually get the benefit of being able to have an orientation of opportunity versus that tendency to shut down and seek to play it safe when it comes to the changing landscape. All right, I want to spend our time today predominantly in talking about methods. I want to talk about how do we build this muscle. If we would go to the jungle gym or gymnasium and build this muscle of getting comfortable being uncomfortable, what would that look like? And to do that, I'm going to share with you a story of the most extraordinary transformation journey I've been on. And I want to hopefully draw out some lessons that can apply for you and then take it into your teams. Now, to do that, I've got to introduce you to someone. This is not a Colgate ad, to be really clear. This is actually my best friend, Charlie, and I. And I don't know if you've got a friend like this in your life. Hands up if you do. Do you have a friend who's just silly enough to say, awesome, I'm in, before you tell them what it is when you're planning something? Excellent. There's a few hands in the room. If you need, I think we all need that friend in our lives. I'm happy to be that friend for you if you need that friend for you. But Charlie is that friend for me. And I called him a few years ago now. And I said to him, I've just read this line. It's actually from an interview I'd done some time back. And it's funny how sometimes when you read things afresh, they hit you in a different way. And Richard Branson had said this line where he said, It's the things that we're afraid of that we most need to do. And it just hit me between the eyes. I thought, oh my God, there's something about that just makes my stomach uncomfortable. Isn't it the things we're afraid of that we want to kind of shove into the cupboard, padlock up the door, never have to see again? What do you mean that we have to get them out and start doing something with them? And Richard was probably late 60s at the time, and he went on to write a book because he, on reflection of his own life, realised he'd had a near-death experience every year of his life. So he's a man that took it to the very extreme in terms of embracing fear and uncertainty. But for some reason, I couldn't move beyond wrestling with this quote. And Charlie said, well, what's your point? And I said, well, how about we guinea pig it? How about every day for 365 days, we do something we're afraid of? He said, awesome, I'm in. So we embarked on a whole year of fear, where every day for a year, we did something we were afraid of. Now, it took us probably 3 months to tell anybody that we were doing this stupid challenge. Because we thought, firstly, they're going to think we've got several screws loose. Or worse, strangely, it actually felt scarier at the time to tell people we were doing the challenge because we were worried that they were going to ask us about the sorts of things we were doing than it was to actually do the fears. So it took us like 3 months to get over that hurdle and actually start owning the fact we were doing this challenge. When we did, what astounded us is that everybody had the same question. Everyone always went, how do you have enough stuff you're afraid of? Is anyone thinking that here? Yeah, a few of you. And we realised really quickly that when we use the word fear, it conjures up the wrong image. We've actually sort of desensitised to the way fear shows up in a day-to-day reality in our personal and professional lives. What do I mean? Well, when I said fear, you maybe thought about something like this, right? Now, don't get me wrong, that does not look like a fun afternoon. But if that's what's getting between you and your goals for this financial year, come see me afterwards. I need to know what you do, all right? It's true, though. We kind of have these grand visions or versions of what fear is, and Hollywood haven't helped with that. It's dramatised, it's sensationalised, it's often things like snakes and spiders and jumping out of planes, and it's not the reality of these daily discomforts that are just not on that radar because they don't quite rate to that extremity, but are absolutely what's stopping and blocking us on a regular basis. It also can look like this in this day and age, I'm not going to lie. I have seen people have full-out almost panic attacks, particularly the one on the right there, when you get into that red zone territory of battery life. Now look, I'm being a little facetious, but I am meaning when I say, particularly around that point, around the need to resensitise to fear. This is an image that was taken in January of that year. I was on an expedition with 100 Australian entrepreneurs and we went into the Antarctic Circle. We got the opportunity to do exactly what this looks like. They call it the polar plunge. You jump into the sort of -3 degree water and it feels like you have had 37 espressos in one go, but you cannot feel your body. In fact, the reason they tie a rope around your waist is because quite often your body shuts down from shock and they have to like pull you back into the boat like you're on the end of a trawler net. But the reason I share this image with you is because in January of that year, when we just started this challenge, that was exactly what I conceived the year would look like. So I was like you and thinking, man, I don't know how we're going to do a whole year of this fear. Because how many times can you hurtle outside your comfort zone and do things like that? How many days can I find the equivalent of a boat in Antarctica and jump off it? Nothing could be further from the experience we had that year. And I consider this to be the single most transformative thing I've done in my life and in my leadership in terms of the way that it's transformed me and it's transformed the cultures that I build and the way that I think about capacity. So I want to share one of the things we learned. And at a basic level, and if you're taking notes, I invite you to draw this out for yourself because it's an interesting one to play along with as we go. We've all kind of got two zones. The first is comfort zone, something that's very familiar. We could also call this a strength zone if we wanted to. This is all the stuff that's gotten you to where you are today. Your technological competency, your ability mathematically, your ability to communicate effectively, people trusting you and the way that you make decisions. Insert whatever it looks like for you. These are things that you feel really comfortable doing and that you know you have a competency around. I'm not going to name them because they're going to be different for everyone in the room, but I will show you the sort of characteristics that are typically associated with them. This is the stuff you find easy, it's safe, You could do it with your eyes closed, back to front, in a foreign language. It's just really a part of your DNA. Now, this stuff is really important for us to acknowledge. And in fact, it's really important in the context of leaning into uncertainty and change. Because sometimes we focus too much on where we're heading next, and we forget that actually one of the most important things we can do for our mindset before we head into the unknown is remind ourselves of the capabilities and competencies we've got that should give us conviction that we can move forward successfully. So it's really useful to start by going, what's in my comfort zone? What would I put in there and say, these are things I can really capably do? Now, the challenge though is, I'm talking to a room full of ambitious people who want results, outcomes, tomorrow, next month, this year, in the next 10 years for themselves that are fundamentally different from where you all are right now. And so the difficulty is, and this is a quote attributed to Einstein, I'm not actually sure Einstein ever said it. If you've noticed, Abe Lincoln, Einstein and Mark Twain said about a third of the most popular inspirational quotes out there. But we'll give Einstein the benefit and say Einstein did say it. He said the definition of insanity is to think that you can keep doing the same thing and you can get a different result. And so then the challenge that is incumbent on all of us is to go, well, how am I moving beyond? What does it look like to go outside of this territory? And in reality, the forces of change are going to pull us there. So it's this false notion we need to get away from the idea that I can stay here and maintain the success that I'm achieving, because the reality of the change around us means that that is to fall behind. So there's a need to create this ability to step out into this second zone that all of us have. And this is the area where it's a little bit uncomfortable. It's uneasy, we're not as sure about it, it's new or it's different. But if you could just, for the purpose of this exercise, hold in the back of your mind a goal that you've got for yourself. It could be a personal one for a promotion or a target or an aspiration you have for you, or it could be something you're trying to drive your team towards this year. Doesn't matter which. But I want you to think about this courage zone relative to that aspiration and goal you've got, and think, what do I need to change in order to get there? One of the great benefits we get of coming together at times like this in conferences and programs of this nature is the opportunity to reflect and ask ourselves a really powerful question, which is, the habits that I'm living and leading with still serving me? And if they're not, how do I choose in this next moment, in this next chapter, to make a different choice? And what I want to invite you to think about today is the choice to step outside into that courage zone and what that could look like for you. Now, in a moment, I'm going to share with you what we've heard from thousands of leaders across the world, because we get the great privilege of doing, in my business, work with leaders in companies and organizations regularly where we get to ask them questions. We're building performance capability, we're building leadership capacity, and we ask them the question, what's stopping you from getting to where you're heading next? What is it, if anything, that's seeing you get in your own way? And interestingly, in a moment, I'm going to share. These are the responses we get. Before I share it, I want you to think for yourself what you might have put there first, all right? This is what leaders tell us. They tell us that it's not about, did you notice actually none of it's about jumping off a boat in Antarctica? Fascinating. No snakes, no spiders. It's a shock sometimes. You go, oh yeah, of course. Because when I tell you about the year of fear that I did, that's exactly what it looked like. I could tell you that I quit my job, really great corporate role, and started my own business that year, but that wasn't the scary bit. The scary bit was actually going from something I was really experienced in and could do with my eyes closed to being a beginner and having to ask for help and say, I don't know, and go on a journey of humbling myself to stumble my way through something again for the first time. The more experienced we get, the scarier it can be to be a beginner and to be in environments where it's okay to say, I don't know, can you help me understand? For a lot of us, a lot of leaders I work with, the single biggest fear for them is having tough conversations with their team, giving the feedback their team needs to hear, helping that story they need to reframe, that candor is kindness. And actually I need to give my team the benefit of incremental feedback in order that we don't have issues down the line. For some of us, it might be putting ourselves out there, pitching a new idea. You might know what the organisation needs to do next, but it terrifies you to think about putting your hand up in the team meeting and going for it. So I want you to think about, relative to your goal that you've got for the next 12 months, What's one thing you'd put in your courage zone? Do you go, if I could bring that into my wheelhouse, if that could become a part of my comfort zone, it would make a material difference towards our progress, towards that outcome, towards that goal, that aspiration. Or in the context that you thought of an organisational goal, and I'll come back to that in a moment, what do I need to bring into my team's comfort zone? Because just as we have rhythms and habits and norms individually, we have them collectively. I've walked into plenty of organisations where they've got take risks, move fast, break things written on the wall, but you wouldn't dare take a risk. It'd be what we call a CLM, a career limiting move. And so we've got to realise we might have the aspiration, but if what we're repeatedly doing isn't matching it, as James Clear says really well, we don't rise to the level of these goals, we fall to the level of our systems. We fall to the level of what we repeatedly do. And so this choice point that's incumbent upon us right now is to think, what's the way I'm going to step outside and move into that courage zone in pursuit of the growth that I'm after to support the goals that I've got for tomorrow? The second thing I want to talk about that's important here is if this stuff were easy, we would already be doing it. So we've got to factor in this second part of the equation, which is this thing called the red line of resistance. There is something that is stopping or blocking or getting in your way. And your job is in part to interrogate what is that and how do I change my relationship with it? Is it ego? Is it politics? Is it process? Is it who I'm hanging around? Because our desire to belong tends to overwhelm our desire to improve. What is it that we need to change and shift? I'm going to give you an example of an organisation that went on this journey so you can understand how this concept could translate to thinking about team culture. And particularly, I'm going to preface this story by saying I'm not suggesting that the habit that they chose is the ideal. What I think is interesting is the intellectual journey they took to get there and interrogate it in their culture. All right, everyone knows this company, right? Early in their journey, they were not innovating fast enough. And so Jeff Bezos went to his executive leadership team and said, gang, work out why we are not moving quicker. I've got big aspirations, goals are up here, take over the world. But we are not getting there quickly. So what's the problem? The team went away, did a little bit of research, came back, and so we've worked it out. The reason is because it is so much easier to say no to things at Amazon than it is to say yes. And we need to fix that. Any great entrepreneur will tell you that it's not about the one great idea, it's actually about the rate of ideation. Pixar have this beautiful phrase for it. They say, every idea starts as an ugly baby. And their point is, no idea comes out of the gates beautiful. Actually, the work we need to do in our organisations and our teams is become masters of how we work things up and test the merit quickly to work out if there's something worth pursuing. And so the goal needs to be, how do we get more out of the gates? So Amazon thought about it and they said, okay, well, what do we want in our courage zone? We want more risk-taking. We want more innovation, more people having a go and experimenting. What's our red line of resistance? Our barrier from a process standpoint internally is it is so much easier to get a no than it is to get a yes. Okay, we've got to get rid of our red line of resistance. So they introduced a new habit, and they consider it a cornerstone habit of their culture, called the institutional yes. And the basic premise is, if you go to your leader at Amazon with an idea, they've got to say yes. Think about that for a moment. That's why I said, preface, you're not all going to love this habit, all right? You're not all going to love this trait. What is interesting is you're going to say no, you've got to write a 3-page memo outlining the reasons you're giving a no. So they flip the friction and they put the friction on the no. Now, that doesn't mean that you're getting access to $500 million out of the blocks. Of course you're not. But what they wanted to do was try and change the relationship so that they were getting a greater rate of ideas, testing them faster, and ultimately seeing more succeed and make it through to maturation than they were when the original hurdle stood as high as that. So what I want to invite you to think about too is relative to your courage zone behaviour. So we've got our goal. We're thinking now about this is the trait that I know I need to get more comfortable with in order to be able to get to my goal. What's the hurdle that's stopping you? Is there a process? Is there a mindset we've got to shift? Maybe it's a fixed mindset, growth mindset, language piece. We've got to change the way that we're talking about something. What we quickly reward tends to be repeated. So it's a really important thing to be mindful of our incentives and our praise culture within our teams and those sorts of things. what I want to do is share with you 3 steps that I learned over my journey that I think are really useful to keep in mind as you think about tackling that move of comfort zone to courage zone. So we're going to talk about how you set up the right fire, how you catch that internal conversation, and how you go about it in a light touch way. I'll explain why all these are important as we go. To begin with, having a why is a bit like the role these 2 animals played in your breakfast this morning. If you all had breakfast at Sky and enjoyed some bacon and eggs, one of these 2 was involved, the other was very, very committed, all right? And that is the key idea around, to begin with, giving ourselves a reason to move outside of our comfort zone. None of us want to do that without a why. It's easy, it's comfortable, it's safe, it's pretty cozy. Comfort zone is kind of like your doona on a really cold day. It's like, why would I get out? There'd better be a motivating reason to shift and lift and head on out the door and go and do something. And so it's really critical that we've got a compelling reason why for ourselves. So the question I want to ask you to begin with, when you think about your courage zone habit, is your why greater than your why not? Because until it is, or until in the context of your team, the why that you're giving them is greater than the why not to do something differently, the why not will win every day because it will default to the way that we currently do things. It takes willpower and effort to move beyond the autopilot rhythms that we're in. And so it's critical to get that commitment to move people from passengers to co-pilots and make them active architects with us, that we think about how do I get a why that can light them up. So is your why greater than your why not? Because when you get to the edge and you're thinking about doing that thing, often the single most important thing you can say to yourself in your head is re-reminding yourself of your reason why. Because it turns on the limbic component of your brain. And that's actually the part of our brains that's critical for behaviour change and for motivation. So if in those moments we don't have that part of the brain turned on, we're going to step back from the edge and we're not going to take that jump and leap into what's next. I want to talk about this in an organisational context too. And I want to give you a why for the organisational context. So if you're sitting there and thinking, geez, my organisation can get a little bit better at building this competency. I wouldn't describe us as a place where we're comfortable being uncomfortable or where we've got a mindset of experimentation and active culture of innovation. I actually spoke this morning with Amy Edmondson, a Harvard professor who many of you might know. She coined a term that has now become, I think, one of the more dominant conversation topics in business. And the reason it's become one of the more dominant conversations, and I think it will popularise and take hold for the next decade in business literature, is because of Google's study a couple of years ago on high-performing teams, a study called Project Aristotle, if you want to go read about it. And what Google did was they went and studied their organisation, they looked at all the high-performing teams in their business, and they were trying to kind of work out the 11 secret herbs and spices of high performance, trying to work out if we kind of sprinkle all these ingredients on everyone else, can we make everyone high-performing? And Google went in with this hypothesis that, look, it's probably that they're just better led. They've got better leaders, their leaders are more competent, that'll be why they're performing higher. Didn't turn out to be true. All right, well, maybe they've got better management systems, like the leaders who are leading high-performing teams just have better structure and discipline to how they do things. Again, didn't hold up. What was interesting about the study is it actually came out and said there are 5 characteristics that every single high-performing team has. But they went a step further and actually said what's even more interesting is that characteristic number 1 matters so much that even if you've got characteristic 2, 3, 4, and 5, you cannot get high performance if you do not have characteristic number 1. And characteristic number 1 is this thing called psychological safety. And Amy Edmondson, the woman I was on a call with this morning, was the lady who coined it in the 1990s, studying high-performing surgical teams in the US. And what was interesting about her original line of inquiry was she was trying to work out what made the difference between the top-ranking hospitals and the bottom-ranking hospitals. And interestingly, the mistake rate and error rate wasn't any different. They both all had graduates from great schools and great talent. What was entirely different was their culture around mistakes. High-performing teams didn't have a culture of shame and blame. They sought to uncover and learn in moments where things went wrong so they could make the entire ecosystem better and richer for it and go again tomorrow. And so she coined this term that Google have now identified. So it's a bedrock now of high-performance literature. It's also playing out an enormous amount in diversity, equity, and inclusion literature. because the data by Edmondson shows us that if we've got a homogenous team, in the absence of psychological safety, they're going to outperform a diverse team every day of the week. When you add psychological safety into the mix, the performance returns for a diverse team leave the other two for dead. So what's interesting about that is it says we've paid a lot of attention to the composition of who sits around a table, which is important, and we need to continue to do that. We've spent very little time thinking about the conditions for how to make sure that diversity gets to show up and actually contribute the rich perspectives and the mix of talent that we brought them to the table for. And so I think there's going to be increasing conversation as we try and tap into talent and capability about this principle. So this is a why. Why should we be caring about building this muscle in our organisation? Because psychological safety is the bedrock of high performance. Because if we're going to hire diverse and talent, we need to focus on the inclusive conditions that are going to allow that talent to thrive. To take it a step further too, there's just 4 levels you can think about reflecting on your question point. And again, it might prompt conversation, a why, for you to go back to your business and discuss this with a bit more gusto. There are 4 stages. First, is it safe to belong in my organisation? Hopefully you can say yes to that, but it's also really important to be mindful that you are one data point in your organisation. Is it safe for people from different backgrounds? Is it safe for people of different orientations? Is it safe for someone that's 2 weeks in the grad program versus someone like yourself who's very senior and experienced? This is not a question about, am I safe? This is a question of, is it safe to belong for everyone? Next, this gets back to what we were talking about earlier. Is it safe to learn? Can I say I don't know in our culture? Is it all right to say, as long as it's followed by, I'm going to go find out, right? But is it okay for us to say that? Or is that something you'd never get away with, or you'd be looked down upon for having let out your mouth? Third, is it safe to contribute? Can I actually show up and offer an opinion? Can I say, how about this? Do you want to hear my perspective? Do you want to hear these diverse perspectives? And finally, the top of the tree, is it safe to challenge? Is it actually safe to put your hand up and say, why are we doing it that way? Or have we ever considered that insert different way? So I'd love for you to think about this as part of your why that you can take back. If you're thinking about how do we build this tolerance, or how do I make the case that we need to build this competency in our organisation of getting comfortable being uncomfortable, or even if you're aiming at a particular behaviour that's in your courage zone, this literature around psychological safety and this progression from belonging to challenge obviously being the ultimate, where you're getting the full benefit of the inclusive culture and you get the full benefit of psychological safety at work for high performance. If you tapped out any earlier in that journey, or you think if we went and benchmarked your organisation you would, think about how you can make this part of the story. And happy in the Q&A later to probe this topic area a lot more. All right, second thing, how do we catch our unconscious narrative? We talked a little bit about this before, it's all about the story. Well, one of the things that's fascinating is we say between 300 and 900 words to ourselves a minute. We are quite extraordinary with our internal monologues. And as we learned from Chris Voss, if that index is 2 to 1 to the negative, we can sometimes end up in a bit of a problem point. So it's really critical that we think about how do we catch that narrative and reshape and reset it. We developed a really simple step process for doing this when we were doing our Year of Fear called fear setting. Now, I've no doubt you're all familiar with its cousin goal setting. You probably wouldn't be in this room if you weren't. But fear setting is the equivalent for how you can do this for the more challenging side of the spectrum, perhaps. And so the 3 stages of fear setting are, number 1, you've got to sit down and write out, stream of consciousness, no stopping, put 60 seconds on the clock, 90 seconds on the clock, whatever you want to do, what you believe is going to happen if you do the thing you're afraid of. That sounds like a really silly exercise, but I can tell you, in 30 seconds, I've seen people go from, I'm going to get up and public speak, to death. It is amazing how we catastrophize things. In fact, you'll work out pretty quickly. You could probably have a side hustle on like Bold and the Beautiful or Young and the Restless if you wanted to. But the important thing of doing this simple exercise is we actually catch our unconscious narrative. And in catching it, we take the oxygen out of it. The second thing we can do to help do that, desensitize ourselves to it, is give ourselves a likelihood score between 1 and 10 that the thing's actually going to happen. In the whole year I did fear, I don't think I got higher than a 7. And so immediately again, you start to go, I'm being a bit silly. That's probably not the way. Next step that's really useful, how do I think about practicing or preparing? So what could I do before the moment where I do the thing I'm afraid of? So how do you give yourself points of evidence that I'm going to be okay here? If you're thinking about having a crucial conversation with someone, performance feedback, it's going to be a tough conversation. How do you ask a colleague maybe to sit down with you? Hey, could we run through it? I just want to make sure I'm prepared for how they might react and I've thought through it. So that again, you're taking yourself into that situation as opposed to doing it for the first time when it's on the line. You've got that evidence, that preparation that can help you prepare. And finally, the third step of fear setting is to plan for what you're going to do if the worst does happen. Now, what's the reason we do that? Is because our brains, when we're surprised, our dopamine levels spike by 400%. Now, that throws us into fight, flight, or freeze, none of which are ideal for making good decisions and handling a situation well. And if left to normal situation, as in we don't take ourselves away and reset our nervous system, that takes about 18 to 22 minutes to calm down on its own. So preparing for what we might do if it goes wrong helps us avoid the dopamine spike at the end and can mean that we're a lot better reasoned and ready for the situation, so we can plan, we can call a pause in the conversation and say, look, I think we're misinterpreting things here. I'd love if we could take some time and come and have another conversation in a couple of days. Or you come up with a couple of strategies for how you're going to do something differently should that situation eventuate. So there are 3 useful steps for thinking about how it is that you work through that. Final thing I want to talk about in this 3-step process is how do you do it lightly? What do I mean here? One of my observations, particularly when I talk to A-type people, and I'm an A-type person so I understand it, is we tend to be pretty all or nothing with this stuff, right? This is why in January I was already jumping off the side of a boat in Antarctica. We hear fear and we go, great, I'm going to hurtle outside my comfort zone. If I can create an analogy for you, that is like the equivalent of going to a gym cold, not having exercised in 5 years, and attempting to bench press 300 kilos. It's probably not going to end well, and you may never make it back to the gym. One of the most important things we can do when we're starting anything like this is to think about how do I go small? We have to start a habit before we optimize it. So the thing here is to make sure we're not moving outside of our courage zone into territory I call the panic zone, because what happens in the panic zone? We actually see overwhelm. We see performance decrease. If I was creating one where we're using something that might be in your courage zone, public speaking could have been one for you professionally. You might say, I know our agenda is so important in our business. I have to increasingly be an advocate for it. I have to be upfront, making our case, helping people understand our strategy, arguing for resources. So I've got to get more comfortable with this public speaking thing. Well, probably don't decide to debut in front of 400 of your colleagues with no notes. That's probably going to push you into panic zone territory. So think about how do you start small, maybe a smaller audience, maybe making some detailed notes. You've got that as a safety net there if you need it. Think about ways where you can break down the start into something small. The other reason this is useful is because change fatigue and burnout is real. And so one of the things that we do by breaking it down into smaller chunks is overcome that particular hurdle. One of the rules that I like, the number of people have popularized different versions of, but is this idea of taking the friction out of starting. So one of the things I'd encourage you to do to continue the gym analogy is think about the idea of going to the gym right now. What's the weight I can comfortably do a few reps with? It's not easy, but it's not too hard. And how do I build reps at that level until that becomes easy? And at that point, I can step that little bit further. So think about what your courage zone habit is. Think about how you maybe break it down to 10 or 20 smaller steps. And from there, work your way through it, almost like a progression of dominoes. Okay, I'm going to start here. I'm going to work my reps until that domino falls. Then it's going to hit that one. I'm going to move to that little bit further outside of my courage zone. Because as we saw back a moment ago, the coolest thing happens. And this is the most extraordinary thing. This is why I say it was the most remarkably transformative thing I've done personally and professionally. The coolest thing happens when you step outside your comfort zone. You can see it there. Your courage zone actually expands. It takes in entirely new territory, your comfort zone, into your courage zone. Things that you found terrifying 6 months ago, 12 months ago, all of a sudden become part of the circumstances and situations where you feel competent and capable to lead and succeed. And that is the reward for effort. That is the personal ROI if you need a why for stepping outside into your courage zone. This is the reason, this is the competitive advantage of the future. Because irrespective of what it holds, this is going to continue to put you in good stead, building this muscle. So it's actually less important what you pick in your courage zone Doesn't matter whether you pick taking risks or having tough conversations. It's more important to build the habit, to just get in a rhythm. Doesn't have to be every day, every week, every month. What am I intentionally doing to take myself out of my comfort zone, to build myself a story and a body of evidence that I can do things I'm afraid of. I can do things I didn't know how to do 6 months ago, because that's going to continue to come up and change your story when you encounter the next thing that's uncertain or unfamiliar, and that's powerful. When it comes to the piece around how do we start, I like to use something that I find really useful for building momentum. It's a tool that I've developed working with a number of high-performing leaders and sports coaches around the world. And it's this really simple thing called 24/7-1. And the reason I like it is because you're all extremely busy. If we think you can go away from this wonderful conference and spend 90% of your time working purely on all the new ideas and things that you've learned, we're kidding ourselves, right? You've got big demands, lots of draws on your attention, but we need to start. Otherwise, we get stuck in that loop that Einstein talked about, where we just keep doing what we've always done. We keep getting the results we've always got. So how do we break that shift down into something that's so small we can get started alongside the busyness of business as usual? 24/7-1's your tool for that. Within 24 hours, leaving this wonderful event, got to take an initial bite-sized action step. It needs to be something so small that it is inexcusable you couldn't get it done. So it could be as simple as, I know one of the best things I did in my year of fear was I had my best mate on the journey with me. So you might go, I'm going to need an accountability buddy. Maybe it's someone who's going to come on the journey with you, or maybe it's someone who's just going to check in periodically and say, hey, how's that going? I know you were trying to work on that. You might email them. That's totally doable within 24 hours. You might call them for 5 minutes. That's totally doable within 24 hours. You might spend 15 minutes later today with your notebook drawing out what's in your courage zone. Totally doable within 24 hours. It needs to be so small, it's inexcusable you couldn't get it done. Next step, 7 days. You take a slightly bigger action step. You might sit down with your accountability buddy, talk to them about the way that you're thinking down, breaking your fear up into smaller bite-sized chunks. You might go and actually seek some research if you're thinking about having tough conversations. Okay, I'm going to go find a couple of articles that tell me how to have really good feedback conversations. Or you might work through that fear-setting process and try and get your narrative out and take the oxygen out of it. Whatever it is that's bigger than 24, you've got 7 days to get it done. And finally, 1 month. Got to take a slightly bigger action step again. So you might have a go at doing your first baby step, making the first domino tip. See how you go. Whatever it is, it's bigger than the 24 and the 7, but you've got a whole month to get it done. And then what I encourage you to do is think about how you use this as a framework, not to do a 24/7-1 once, but to continually reset and go about incremental gains. Because success and change isn't actually about radical change, it's about accruing small gains. And so what we want here is a process where we can accrue small gains alongside the busyness of business as usual. And 24/7-1 is a great way of doing that. So at the end of that month, you reflect on all the learnings, all the progress, all the insights or connections you've got, and you write a new 24/7-1 for the next month. Reason being, our greatest ally when we're trying to make change is momentum. And so the more that we can give ourselves a sense of progress, the greater the likelihood we continue on this journey. So I'm going to take a moment to answer questions. Before I leave you, I just want to share, if anyone wants to stay connected, I've got a free 3-minute read that pops in to your inbox on a Monday morning based on an insight that the lowest mental health moment of Australian weeks is 8 to 10 a.m. on a Monday morning. So we provide practical insight, and no, it doesn't surprise anyone, does it ever? We provide practical insights and an energy kick to get you through your week and some strategies for things you can bring to leadership to help you be more effective. Love you to join the community if you're interested in reading and participating in that. The most important thing I want to leave you with is this notion. Your future is defined not by what you do tomorrow, but by what you do today. And if I can encourage you to do anything at the end of what I've just shared, it would be to think about how can I take that first 24-hour step to get comfortable being uncomfortable, the competitive advantage of the future. Thank you so much for having me, everyone.